Hi, everyone. We are presenting V.O.I.C.E, which is voice, ownership, identity, control, and expression. It's a data-driven taxonomy for synthetic voice generation. I'm here, Tanusree, and Lili will be presenting with me. So first of all, I'd like to start with one audio, and I'd like to see if any of you recognize that.
Tell me, what is it you want out of life? Fortune, glory, the thrill of adventure. I'm offering you a chance at all three. You just need to do me one small favor.
What about now? Anyone? Any guess? Yes? Oh.
Yes.
All right. Anyone else? Already? Okay. All right. So this is Amelia Tyler. She is okay, stop now. All right. She is a BAFTA-nominated actor. And in 2024, Tyler publicly spoke out because after her voice had been cloned and used in explicit content. And she called it stealing her job and stealing her identity. And she was right. Because it's not also something just stealing the job and identity, it's also something more legally and technically precise than that. It's her voice, it's biometric, and used without consent, and scaled. And Amelia Tyler could speak out because she had a platform, an audience, and legal resources that most of the people don't have. And in our collected data, we have found this kind of pattern, many of them, just without that visibility. So it's not really theoretical anymore. They are active prosecution. Offender has been using this kind of synthetic voice with real name and face to create and produce and distribute child sexual abuse materials. And so the moment voice synthesis interact with the personal identifiable information, the harm doesn't just grow linearly. It's just compound in many risk pathways. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We'll cover US regulatory landscape, then V.O.I.C.E taxonomy, we'll walk you through it, and close with what we think we need to go from here. So I'll hand over to Lili to walk you through the US regulatory landscape.
Okay, thank you. All right, so to begin, I'll give a brief background of the US regulations. So historically, in the United States, all of our regulatory bodies have been decentralized in this topic, specifically only really occurring at the state level. And on the state level regulations, they focused on generally transparency, consumer rights, and algorithmic accountability. However, there's been an increase in focus from the federal government, and there has been no comprehensive federal AI regulation passed through Congress yet. But there are many contenders. And so this is a very tiny fonted table that if you want to read the paper, you can go look at every detail. But to begin, we want to look at a basic comparison of these proposed federal regulations and some of the most relevant existing state regulations. So we asked a few simple questions to begin. So first, we wanted to look at how each one actually treated voice generation. Then, who are they requiring disclosure to? And how these regulations impact three categories of subjects: the public, professional, and high profile. And so, as to reiterate, again, this is a huge important thing. No congressional or other federal regulations listed have been passed as of today. So these are all looking towards future potential possibilities. And so I mentioned disclosure. Disclosure, the way it interacts in these specific pieces of federal proposed regulation is pretty individualized. They're specific to the way each regulation is worded, but there is some pattern as to who the disclosure is required to. So disclosure to users is the most common type of disclosure, and it's commonly referencing sensitive private data as like the term they're using for that, as what needs to be disclosed and transparently communicated. And a good example of this is the Stop Spying Bosses Act. It requires employers to tell workers what AI surveillance is occurring with them. Disclosure to the public is prioritized in bills that cover more public impacting AI technologies, so specifically deepfakes in the Real Political Advertisements Act and No Fakes Act. And disclosure to the government is less common, and it's prioritized by regulations that want to focus on tighter relationships between the federal government and AI companies, aligning with executive order priorities. And so here I have a graph that overviews the landscape between state regulations and federal regulations. And when you look at all of them from a high level, I want to draw attention to these three things. Does the regulation pertain to privacy protections? Does it require at least one type of disclosure? And does it apply to synthetic audio explicitly? For that last question, if audio is not specified, it was not included in that sphere. And so while there were some state regulations that fulfilled all three of these categories that we were looking at, none of the federal legislation addresses all of these aspects. And that is potentially a larger problem and a gap that's going to grow as the federal regulations are passed or not passed, or we see what happens in the future. And so briefly, I also want to draw some attention to the patterns of disclosure, as more often than not, disclosure flows from one requirement to another. The pattern that's most common is that disclosure to users is required and then disclosure to the public. A big notable example to this is at the federal level is the Sandbox Act, which is the sole one that does not explicitly mention user disclosure while requiring disclosure to the public and the government. And then on the left is an hourglass that I sketched up as a metaphor for communicating the frequency of each type of disclosure pattern. So the majority of the sand is in the top half of that hourglass, which are the regulatory requirements. And there are very few grains of sand that pass through the filter of disclosure to disclose to the government directly. So you can kind of see the volumes in each of those categories. And so specifically, voice actors as a population sit in an interesting position across all of these regulations. And so drawing attention to one proposed regulation that is highly impactful for another population category I'm going to talk about in a minute, the No Fakes Act. It can remove digital replicas of the likeness of these voice actors online. But a negative of that would be for this population is that it may be resource intensive to have them manually remove them because it requires a manual request removal. And though voice actors are professionals and may be well known for their voice, they may not have the fame, resources, and attention to specifically be able to go through that whole process. So a large takeaway from looking at some of these most impactful proposed regulations is that increased disclosure does not equal increased agency and options. And so for high profile, which includes celebrities, politicians, anyone with a large amount of fame or resources, it's kind of the opposite, where material resources and fame lessen some of the negative impacts, but they increase the options and also increase the target on their back for the amount of times that this would potentially happen to them.
All right, that's the regulatory landscape. Now let's get into the incident themselves. So what they told us about voice risk, how this actually work, we pulled from 4 large-scale database, AI incident database like OECD, AI incident, FTC, and IC3. And that gave us 569 incidents from general public, high-profile actors, celebrities, and voice actors. And then we also looked into the database, because database doesn't tell us all of the contextual and also the incident that has not been reported. So we also collected from 1,069 direct report from that population group. Fortunately, we had another voice actor community as well as colleagues who made this connection for us to get those reporting. And we then categorized those incidents and formalized threat models, risk pathways. And that's the foundation that taxonomy is built on. Now, we organized this taxonomy into 6 high-level categories. We do not want to make certain unrealistic claim that this taxonomy would be the final one, because, but we can say that this data source we leverage a real incident. So we believe that it's a sufficient data source to define the risk categories. And we will keep adding risk if it's emerged, but honestly, I do hope that doesn't need to be the case because that would mean that fewer people are impacted by voice synthesis. I want to highlight these 2 categories that sits at the opposite corner of their spectrum First one is organizational security and espionage risk, and the second one is psychological and social harm. And the first one deeply related to something that impact industry and government. And the second one is deeply personal. It affects all the group regardless their visibility. But the harm is not really, even though the harm is universal, but the way people impacted and the way they can recover are very different. So I'll go with only one example just to show the pipeline how we build this taxonomy and the risk modeling. Let's start with incident we all probably know. Senator Ben Cardin got on a Zoom call with a perfect synthetic replica of a diplomat he thought he knew. And the voice was right, the face was right. What really make difference? The questions been asked, which is a contextual cues. So contextual cues really matters. Now, bring that to your organizational security risk. How these risk interactions really happen in organizational process. For example, remote hiring process, okay? So risk interactions start without you knowing it. Voice that already out there. Your employee might give a talk, right? And then record podcast or present an conference like this one. That's the first step. And then the step 2 is this audio gets collected, likeness get built, and then honestly, it does not take much because there is a functional industry where you can just spend $300 to have a 1-minute clips with accent adaptations and emotional inflection and so on. And that's a service industry right now. And step 3 is that voice, the synthesized voice gets paired with stolen PII, name, face, fabricated work history, and walks into a remote hiring process. And this is not hypothetical. It's from the incident registry of FBI's IC3 has documented that fraudulent applicants targeting IT, database, and engineering roles. And now the other side of the coin, the job applicants, it's now also they're wondering the same thing in the reverse. Is the recruiter is real? If they are the target of a voice harvesting scam, especially when there is a lot of boom of startup industry, AI industry, things like that. So now, if you look at traditional risk assessment, what we assume in the traditional risk assessment that a single point of time something is happening, it's traceable, and there is an accountable party there, so we can measure the countable loss. Like data breach, financial loss has a date, a system, and accountable responsible party. So we also assume that all users of a system face roughly comparable risk. But synthetic voice, or you can also say generalizably, the AI risk does not really work that way. So harm is not a moment, it's a chain. So we conceptualize the risk as a function of capability, exposure, and the propagation of the risk in different level. You can divide that by the governance and accountability, how much regulatory resources some group has than others. So higher risk access and higher access or wider spread can amplify the risk. For example, a voice actor might have their voice publicly available, so they might have a higher risk exposure than the general public, but voice actor might not have those regulatory resources that high-profile personnel has. So the way they can protect against it, dampen it. So, and the second thing is the risk pathway, which is very important and the difficult part to solve here, because there is a different channel this risk really propagates, and if we cannot figure out what's the full-scale attack and what's really attempted attack happen, what is successful and not successful, that's really important to figure out. And it's more important and difficult for psychological and social harm. This is something we still yet to figure out. The harm is real, but the pathway is too difficult and too diffuse to kind of collapse into a single number of currently in this method that we kind of conceptualized. Now, I would like to kind of talk about where do we go from here. So in the most voice AI benchmark today that measure technical performance like voice quality, likeness, speaker similarity, defect detection, things like that. So the way voice taxonomy, this risk or contextual information can complement with this context-specific scenario that we have built with threat models and specific scenario in context. So instead of asking how good does the voice sound, it can let you ask, in case of this, again, remote hiring process, can this model generate a convincing enough candidate to fraudulently pass a remote job interview? So taxonomy can give you this scenario-specific annotated risk data and threat modeling with a soft quantification method. All right, so one thing we are actively exploring ourselves, I already told you how it could be used in your case, but something that we're exploring firsthand to put this taxonomy to work in practice. We plugged this voice risk taxonomy into our tool called Origin Story. So Visar Barisa, my co-author, could not be here, but so he sent me the GIF file of himself using the Origin Story, which is a very on brand of someone building the tool and proving that he's a human. So this Origin Story is a hardware-rooted voice provenance tools, a radar sensor that capture your biomechanical movement, jaw, throat movement, and compare that with acoustic signal to say if it's a human or not. So like this system, there is a lot of detection system we know, and they have their own metrics. So the way we are conceptualizing this taxonomy could help to add the contextual risk information that people are still relying on as a good signal. So we're testing this out, and in the Slack channel, I'll be kind of looking for people who'd like to try out, who have experience in a hiring process, what they really like to have in a video conferencing tool or in their hiring tool, and would love to talk about it more. And with that, thank you so much for listening, and we'd be happy to take any questions. We have 2 minutes.